After talking to Hoffman Tactical about weapon and design, and then doing a little myself on the T-Rex Labs YouTube channel, I think we're going to dig a little bit deeper today. Welcome back to another T-Rex Talk. We're going to be discussing a few books. If you've been paying attention to past episodes, last week we talked to Tim Hoffman of Hoffman Tactical, and he is doing some really interesting design in the field of 3D printed firearms, which generally for him involves a couple of different things. Either he is taking existing off-the-shelf parts and modifying them so they can be 3D printed, which usually involves reinforcing parts that are meant to be metal so that they work a little better in plastic. Or occasionally, which we didn't talk about a whole lot when we had our conversation, he is making new parts that do slightly different things, like his super safety. If you don't know about his super safety, all I will say is that it is super safe. It adds some functionality to a weapon, but I'm not going to go into a whole lot more details. But as I talked to him, I was also thinking through the script for a T-Rex Labs video, which has been posted last week, Friday morning, and that is called The Future of the Fighting Handgun, and it went into some really superficial detail on how future pistols might be made based on new trends in optics and in suppressors and potentially in materials and manufacturing technology. And that is a relatively popular video. It's nothing compared to some YouTube videos, but it's so far the most popular T-Rex Labs video. It's collected the most views in the shortest amount of time, so obviously this is a topic that people find interesting. Which means it's worth doing another episode on. But the main reason I wanted to do a T-Rex Talk episode is to talk more about the 3 books that I mentioned in the T-Rex Labs video. These are 3 books that are written by David S. Findlay, which is it is a series. I'm not sure how long he wants the series to be, but there are 3 books in the series so far. David Findlay is a firearm designer. He's worked at Remington for 26 years. He's worked at Marlin. He's done a whole bunch of different things in the firearm industry as an engineer, safety engineer, testing engineer, manufacturing engineer. He's a Smith & Wesson right now. He has firearms patents, and he has these 3 books right here. The Firearm Anatomy series starts off talking about the Thompson submachine gun, and these are fascinating books to have. They're not necessarily books that you read per se. The first third of the book is readable text. The second 2/3 of the book are all of the technical drawings for all of the parts for whichever firearm he's talking about. So book 1 is Thompson submachine gun, book 2 is the Sten submachine gun, and then book 3 is the Remington double Deringer, which is possibly the firearm that I am least interested in on the face of the earth, but it might be my favorite of the series for reasons which I will get into. But I wanted to talk about these books because the last few book reviews have been gun control books, negative books. And I know that you guys tend to like it when I review books from the other side and talk about them, but sometimes it's fun to read books that are a little bit more in line with my interests, and I can talk to you about those things. I am still going through. I have a stack. I got a bunch of recommendations from you guys on gun control books from the left, and one that I have been paging through a little bit recently is called Loaded: A Disarming History of the Second Amendment by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And I don't think I'm going to review this book. I really don't think that it's worth the time. But I do want to mention something about it, which is really interesting. As the political discourse changes, there will be different emotional hot buttons that people pull up when they want to talk about firearms. And when we're talking about manufacturing firearms, this is an interesting book to bring up because her whole basic thesis in the book is not super clear, but she wants guns to be banned, specifically the private ownership of guns to be banned. And the history of the Second Amendment in her eyes is just racist and terrible. It is the classic oppressor versus victim mentality. Everything is divided along those lines. She has a kind of an interesting history. She grew up in rural Oklahoma. She's old enough. She's a little older than me, which means that just means not Tulsa. I was also born in not Tulsa, rural Oklahoma. I don't live there now, and neither does she. She lives in San Francisco, which is a perfect place for someone of her political bent, I would say. But the book is kind of inconsistent because the book tries to posit that there is a secret history of the Second Amendment. The secret history of the Second Amendment is not freedom and liberty, but it is oppression and racism. And so she pulls a few historical quotes from the past to buttress this. There's essentially just quotes where people are talking about the Indian Wars. But then she says that all other historical quotes about the Second Amendment, things that do refer to freedom and liberty and stuff like that, are myths. Even the myth of the hunter. She has a whole chapter on that. And she just completely ignores or poo-poos the idea that the Second Amendment is to check violent oppressors. She's sure that that is a complete and total myth. That is historical revisionism that the NRA came up with fairly recently. And she blames private gun ownership for everything. She blames it for the Indian Wars in the early 16 and 1700s because the settlers were able to defend themselves. But she also blames private gun ownership somehow for the Indian exterminations that came later. I mean, I guess that's kind of sort of true because it was the federal government that killed most of the Native Americans when the Native Americans didn't want to be disarmed. So she's not super consistent except for the fact that guns are bad. She doesn't like it when individuals have guns. She doesn't like it when groups have guns. She doesn't like it when militias have guns, but she does like it when the federal government has guns. But also when the federal government uses guns to kill Native Americans, that's bad, and it's proof that private ownership of guns is somehow bad. The only thing that is truly consistent is that guns are bad because they cause violence. And she doesn't believe that the Native Americans were the bad guys in any of these conflicts, nor were all the bloodthirsty and blood-soaked violent years of previous centuries in North America. Just totally irrelevant to her concept because no guns. That was a pre-gun world. So, this is, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this particular author or this particular book. But one of the things that comes out very clearly in the book, because the history of the world, Native Americans, Native Europeans, non-Native peoples, etc., is one of violence, and it is one of weapons. The best way that you can perpetrate violence on other people or defend yourself from the violence of other people is going to be with weapons. And the more sophisticated weapons become, some people would say the more deadly they become. But actually, I think there's a better way to measure the sophistication of weapons. And it isn't killing power necessarily, but it is the ability of a weaker person or a less skilled person to use the weapon. So fists and feet is almost entirely strength-based. And then as you pick up blunt objects, you are able to magnify the force that you can bring to bear, but you still have to be able to bring some force to bear. Then edged weapons come along. You can apply force and do violence with less physical effort, but it still requires a fair amount of skill. It isn't until you get to firearms that they are really able to equalize the physical force of the combatants, and to some extent, to a large extent, the skills. Obviously, there's a lot of skills in operating firearms and combat and all the different things that you can go and take courses for, but you understand that there is a massive difference between training for years, decades, generations to be a good longbowman versus, being able to pull a trigger. And I think history makes it clear that there is a continuum of human violence and there is a spectrum of weapons that are out there. Guns are merely the most sophisticated way to send projectiles for the last 500-ish years. They're not that different than the devices that we use to fire projectiles more than 500 years ago. But in the gun control movement, in the leftist movement, guns are special. They are specifically interesting and unique. and they have some sort of mythos about them. They have some sort of power about them. Firearms are a special type of magical device, and if we could just control them somehow, the violence would go away. That's the way that a lot of people think about this stuff. That's the way that a lot of people see this stuff, and that's why you get things like rules on YouTube that talk about videos that show the assembly or the manufacture or the construction of firearms are verboten, even though it's completely legal, and then videos that show other things that are illegal are fine. Guns are very, very special in the minds of certain people, and they're unlike any other device. And when you see people talk about certain gun control legislative ideas, and they talk about gun parts, even the gun parts have this magical, intangible thing that require tight controls, even though they couldn't necessarily define specific gun parts. Pins and springs and cams and stuff that is just really off-the-shelf mechanical stuff. That has to be tightly controlled because it contains the soul of the gun somehow. It twists men and bends them toward violent evil and so forth. So that being said, I completely reject that. Guns are mechanical tools, like all other mechanical tools. They need to be understood from an engineering perspective. They are interesting to build, and they display a lot of different aspects of an underlying culture or civilization. Not only their technical ability, but also the way that they think about firearms and weapons and what is worth preserving and what is worth building. So I think firearms are fascinating to study from a whole bunch of different perspectives or contexts. There's a whole bunch of different facets to firearms that are worth looking at. And sometimes I like to take a break from the furor of the anti-gun crowd and the pro-gun crowd, talking about them as if they are specific talismans, and just get into the nitty-gritty of the mechanical and the engineering side. And that is what I really appreciate about these David S. Findlay books. He is an engineer. I am not an engineer, but this is something that I find fascinating and that I find interesting. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of the three books, and then I want to actually go through some of the comments on that T-Rex Labs video on the future of the fighting handgun, because there's, believe it or not, there's some stuff that I forgot to say, and then there's some stuff that I was wrong about, and then there's some great points brought up in the comments. So we will do that. But Firearm Anatomy, Book 1, the Thompson M1A1 Submachine Gun by David S. Findlay. Now, it's worth pointing out that there have been a few different iterations of the Tommy gun. There's the very first one that was made, and it had an incredibly complicated setup. And it was actually built on some crazy assumptions about material properties that weren't correct. There was a guy named Blish, and he had a theory about how different types of metals were going to have different types of friction based on their differences. And he had a patent on this, even though it hadn't necessarily been proven and has been actually disproven now. But this is something that the original Thompson submachine gun that was built by Colt had. Auto Ordnance was the corporation, and there's some history in here of that. And there are some specific dates. This is really interesting for people who want to know the history of the gun, to have the specific dates of when stuff was made, which changes to the design were made and by whom, which manufacturing companies were involved in building these things out, the different materials, the different quantities. This is interesting for those of you who are collectors or want to know more specifically about the Thompson submachine gun as a historical artifact. But then Chapter 2 gets into the technical analysis, and he talks a lot about the impulse of the weapon itself, how you actually model the recoil, how you actually model and measure the pressure versus time, basic firearm physics stuff. Now, there are some relatively complicated equations here if you're not an engineer, but they're relatively simple, actually. And then tables of bullet calculation. And once you understand some of these equations, you could use these same equations to figure out stuff about other firearms. And he goes into the design of this blowback style submachine gun. It's a very simple design once it becomes the M1A1, which is what the government ordered for World War II and what the Marines carried and the Army. It was pretty widely issued. He also builds a model, not of the entire gun, but the action of the M1A1 inside of something called Working Model 2D software, which is a simulation software. And he runs the simulation of the gun cycling and firing, but then he compares that to footage and sound files of an actual M1A1 firing and uses that to tweak his model. So I would say that this is a helpful book for people who want to have a historical understanding of the weapon, because there's some good research there. But there's also just some really interesting stuff about engineering and figuring stuff out. For those of you who are interested in weapon design, this is great. And then by the time it gets to chapter 8, we get into the actual drawings, the technical drawings of all of the parts. And what this is kind of interesting. It's not based on the original drawings that Auto Ordnance gave to Colt. It's not based on the original setup that was manufactured for the Army. This is reverse engineered. This is him taking apart, measuring, and reconstructing the Thompson submachine gun in technical drawings from finished parts. The third reason that I would consider owning these books, if you are not a Thompson collector or you're not a firearm engineer yourself, is just to have for reference all of these particular parts. I think that in the future, these kind of technical drawings are exactly the sort of thing that people who believe that guns are intrinsically evil, they're ontologically evil. Somehow, even this gun part, the trigger of the M1A1 Thompson is a magically evil gun part in and of itself, or even just the drawing of it on paper is something that has to be controlled because the consequences of it being out in the clear and free are too great. Just having these drawings is really helpful. There's actually a fourth reason that I am going to have these books somewhat handy and refer to them is occasionally I need to do technical drawings of my own parts, usually stuff that we open source, and I'm not an engineer, I'm not a draftsman, so sometimes it's really helpful to pull out somebody else's drawings and remember like, oh yeah, that's the icon that you use for the center line or the radius, or oh yeah, that's the way that you draw the inner diameter, and that's where you put the arrows when your part is shaped like that, because kind of self-taught. The next book in the series, book 2, is the Sten submachine gun, and it's really interesting to compare the Thompson and the Sten. The Sten was designed to be manufactured ridiculously cheaply with very simple materials. And he goes through some of the same stuff at the beginning of the book, the different equations that you use to figure out what your pressures are going to be, what your bullet speeds are going to be, how the weapon is actually going to cycle. And there's also some history of the guys who invented the Sten and some of the ways that it came about, and a 3D model that he simulates and compares to footage and audio of the Sten actually firing. But he also goes in a little bit more to firearm metallurgy and heat treatment. Unlike the Colt, the Sten is made with cheaper materials and cheaper manufacturing techniques. It's a lot of stamped parts. It's a lot of bent and folded parts. He talks about the barrel a little bit more. And again, there's technical drawings of every single part. Fewer parts, I believe, than the Thompson. But again, if you have this book, you now have complete technical documents for building your own Sten gun, or just knowing about how the Sten gun itself works. Now, the Sten gun is interesting because so these drawings are reverse engineered from other working Sten guns. But the Sten gun itself was kind of reverse engineered as well. It was based somewhat on a captured German MP-28 and modified for manufacture and modified for various other reasons. And from December of 1940 to January 8th of 1941 is basically the design process. So very, very quickly whacked together, 36 days. By March, they've already finished the Sten Mark II, and they're making hundreds of thousands of these guns. And at that time, 1941, 1942, this idea that firearms were magically and intrinsically evil weapons, evil mechanical devices, evil physical devices hadn't really settled in. In fact, a lot of Sten guns and a lot of other firearms were throughout Britain given to random citizens, because home defense was extremely important. There were a lot of regular citizens inside of Britain who were expected to be armed so that they could defend their homeland against paratroopers or other types of German invaders. The idea that the populace, the citizenry, would be armed and would be capable of military-style combat was alive and well even in the middle of the 20th century in Britain, which is kind of a far cry from where things are today. The third book in the Firearm Anatomy series is the Remington Double Derringer. And I mentioned that this is not my favorite gun. You've seen them. If you're not watching this podcast in video format. Oh, that's the other thing I was going to mention. For those of you who are on Spotify, you may or may not have noticed that this podcast is in video format now. It has been for a few episodes. But if you're like me and you just download your podcast as MP3 files using RSS, the way that podcasts are supposed to work, there's no video. So yeah, I'm trying not to make the podcast's video dependent by pointing at and holding up and looking at the pictures here. But for those of you who really want to see me looking at the camera occasionally and looking at the books more often and just talking into a microphone, you can go to Spotify. And if you're a Spotify member, you can watch video of these podcasts. Otherwise, you can do what I think is best for podcasts. You have an RSS reader, you have an app on your phone, something like AntennaPod, and when a new podcast comes out, you download an MP3 file, and that MP3 file is yours. It's saved on the device for as long as you want. You can archive it, and you're not dependent on platforms quite as much. So, yeah. You can consume podcasts how you want. But back to the Derringer. If you're not watching video, the Remington Double Derringer is a classic gun that you would immediately recognize because it's what gamblers and sneaky bad guys in old westerns always have. It's the little teeny tiny hides in your hand, hides in your boot, hides up your sleeve Derringer with two barrels. And the original were chambered for kind of a bizarre cartridge, which was 4-1 short rimfire. So part of the gun is analyzing this specific round and the ballistics of the specific round, which is neat because Thompson fires 45 ACP, Sten submachine gun fires 9mm, and there isn't as much time spent on the ballistics of those rounds, more the way that they operate the gun, they operate the action. Because the Remington Double Derringer is a super simple gun where you just break it open, put two things in, lock it closed, and then there's a firing pin that is hit by the hammer. It is extremely straightforward, so he is able to spend a little bit more time on the round itself, and he spends a little bit more time on design for manufacture and metal, different types of metallurgy, and designing something for strength. The hinge pin of this Derringer is literally a single hinge on the top where you break it open. And this is a weak area. A lot of historical examples of this firearm and its knockoffs have cracks up there. And then there are modern versions that have slightly different construction, but basically the same mechanics. And so being able to simulate metal fatigue and metal failure and things like that inside of a CAD package so that you can make sure that you have all the strength that you need for something that is going to be fired is really interesting and cool. And I appreciate that this third volume of the book covers more than just the action of the pistol. It covers more manufacturing type stuff. And then, of course, all of the parts of the Remington Derringer are represented in technical drawings. He also includes all the patents that are involved in these different things and a bunch of stuff about springs. There's more stuff about springs, how springs are made and how springs work and how springs should be modeled and thought of, either with fancy software or on paper and in Excel spreadsheets. And some of you may be wondering why, if these books talk so much about different simulations inside of softwares, and they have all these drawings that have been done inside of CAD packages. And there's actually several Excel spreadsheets that he shows you how to set up. This is the sort of book that 20 years ago probably would have come with a CD-ROM sleeve stuck on the inside so that you could have all of those files. They don't have any digital files, but in some ways I actually feel like if you use these books as a learning tool, you're much better off following the instructions and building your own thing than just opening an Excel 97 spreadsheet off of a CD-ROM, if you even have a CD-ROM drive anymore. So this is, I think, a really interesting educational, historical, and reference series. And I hope that he continues the series. I'd love to know what he is planning to do next. If book 4 is something completely and wildly different that lets him focus on a specific aspect of firearm design or manufacture that he hasn't covered yet, I've already decided I'm definitely buying volume 4. And there's, again, a couple of reasons for that. One, I think these are great reference books. I find them useful. Two, I like supporting guys who are doing this kind of teaching and technical documentation. And then, and then fourth, I would like to, or third, I lost track of my own points. I do think it is important that this type of information not be lost. So the very least that I can do is have copies of these on my own shelf, and in hopes that when people need them in the future, we have this stuff lying around. So let's go to the comments on the YouTube video real quick. Last week's YouTube video, which was the next generation of duty pistols, the future of the fighting handgun, is kind of the opposite of David Findlay's books. There is no detailed technical analysis. There are no good calculations. There's no Excel spreadsheets, no math. Well, almost no math. But there are models, 3D models, of what I think different things might look like. I guess they are a little bit like Findlay's work in that I'm looking back at some historical firearms for inspiration. So I don't want to belabor that video. If you're interested, you can go and watch it on the T-Rex Labs YouTube channel. But we'll go over some of the comments now, because there's stuff that I forgot to mention, and there's stuff that I was wrong about. The first comments are generally about YouTube policies, which is another thing that I want to mention. I already mentioned how YouTube doesn't want any type of gun construction, gun assembly, any do-it-yourself gun stuff on YouTube because, again, guns are ontologically evil. There is a soul inside of every firearm part that is just utterly demonic, and so you can't have that stuff on YouTube. So people commenting on that. And then someone dropped in, said, just here to drop a comment to say hi to people in 15 years when they come back to laugh because we're all still using Gen 3 Glocks. That is a fantastic observation, because as fun as it is to talk about future weapons that are going to not just be another Glock or another AR-15, but try to get into some new manufacturing technologies or to get into some new actions. There is a tremendous amount of reliability in something that is tried and tested and has been for decades. And I carry a Gen 3 Glock most of the time and a Gen 4 Glock some of the time. And you have seen me talk about in SHOT Show coverage how I simultaneously want to see really daring, gutsy, innovative stuff, but also I don't trust any of it. I just want Glock to go back to making Gen 3 Glocks. I don't think this is necessarily hypocritical. I think that you need to do both of these things. The gun industry needs to be doing both, providing perfectly durable, utterly dependable, time-tested, and affordable things to people who need them, and innovating on the side. And sometimes this is done by a single company, but other times this is sort of spread across multiple companies. So there are companies that don't push innovation into the bleeding edge of danger and failure. And then there are companies who do. And then there are companies who pretty much only experiment. I think Keltec is a great example of a company that experiments. And they don't necessarily make firearms. They're not trying to win military contracts. They're not trying to build you something that your life can be utterly depending on, regardless of the situations. But they are tinkering with some of these new ideas, some of these new materials. And then what I love about Keltec is everything that they make is available for sale, if it can stay in stock. But then all the designs are available for free. Stuff doesn't get patented and protected. So Keltec will make stuff. Like the PLR-16 is a great example of this. I really want to talk about the PLR-16 and the SU-16, some of that family of weapons. Those came out before the SCAR. Those came out before the MCX. Those came out before buffered ARs were really a thing. They came out with a buffered AR platform, essentially, inside of a plastic shell that weighed almost nothing, that was incredibly cheap. It wasn't something that you could completely depend upon. It wasn't something that you would want to take into battle necessarily, but that came out years before other companies started to do short stroke buffer stuff with the AR platform, and now everyone is doing it. So in many ways, they lead the way on that innovation side, even though everyone looks at their guns and says that they're toys. In some ways, they're toys in that they are fun to plink with. I need to get their latest 22 pistol, but I really like what they've done with some of their toys is kind of the wrong word, but they're more recreational firearms. But their more advanced firearm designs are also really cool. And people will say the PLR-16 failed because it's not a combat weapon. And it's like, well, it didn't really fail because it wasn't trying to be that. And then secondly, a lot of the design elements of the PLR-16 are now in combat firearms. So maybe it didn't fail. But it's important that the industry do both of these things, that the industry continue to make stuff that is time tested and completely proven and functional, and experiment with the new stuff. And one of the things that didn't come across in the video is, after messing with rotary barrels and talking about gas systems and talking about different ways of cycling or handling recoil management inside of a pistol platform, when you explore some of those things, you realize just how incredibly good Browning's tilt action, the tilt barrel system is. It's just incredible. And for anyone who decides that it's not worth testing anything else in the future, I kind of agree with you. So this is a good thing to point out. I also got something very wrong about the Logo Alien, and I think the HKP7 as well, when I mentioned that they were gas operated. Technically, they are gas delayed. But in my defense, I think I kind of said the wrong word. And also in my defense, I'm not 100% wrong, because operation and the delay of other operations are kind of tightly woven. So I could argue that I wasn't 100% completely wrong. But technically speaking, the gas isn't running the entire action in those pistols. It is running the delaying action, and the recoil is doing the rest. People pointing out that they appreciated seeing the Bridgeport, and I didn't show the lathe, but shooting this video in our machine room, I think, made sense, even though we didn't make anything. I think it helped point out the foolishness of the YouTube rules. Someone pointing out that Brass Facts has great PDW content. That is, I can't believe I missed calling them out. I pointed out that 9-Hole Reviews has some great content, but Brass Facts is also great. People pointing out that the gun that I started to design is a lot like the Taurus TX22 comp. This is true. They look really similar, but if you want to run 22 caliber ammo, it's super easy. You just do straight blowback because the pressure is almost nothing, and you just do a fixed barrel and you're done. If you want to run bigger and more powerful ammo, you need a more complicated action. That was kind of what I was doing. And then people pointed out I did not mention the Maxim 9, and this is true, and it kind of breaks my heart, because we actually have a Maxim 9 at the shop, and I really love it, and I wanted to have it in the video. The problem is the way that the YouTube rules are written, and they're new. They went into effect on the 18th, so we haven't even really seen how these rules are going to be applied. I didn't want to show all the stuff that we have, and I didn't want to 3D print prototypes, and I didn't want to build little mock-ups of stuff, because that's just... I thought it was better to just stick to the 3D models on the screen, point out that YouTube's rules are bad, and not go down that rabbit hole, which is a shame, because we have a lot of that stuff. We have bullpups, and we have some of these interesting guns, and we have the Maxim 9. And what a lot of people pointed out is Silencer Co. they have the Maxim 9 as it was manufactured and shipped with an integrated suppressor. And you can lengthen or shorten that based on swapping out some of the baffle parts on the inside. But they also built and they never took it to market, but they also built an unsuppressed version, which is really similar to the pistol that I mocked up and showed on screen. It has a fixed barrel so that you can mount a red dot, a non-reciprocating red dot. The slide is basically cut in half, only the back moves, and I believe it's roller delayed, if I remember correctly. So there's a whole bunch of really interesting stuff inside of that unsuppressed Silencer Co. Maxim 9. And my understanding is they prototyped it. I saw pictures of it. I saw people talking about it, but it never actually came to market. I have no idea what happened because I have much more insight into the firearm industry now and a lot more connections. But all that happened when T-Rex Arms was a very tiny holster company and I was doing other stuff. So I have no insider knowledge about what went on, only just stuff that I maybe have thoughts or guesses about. But I really wish, and Silencer Co. Saw the post and commented on it and added some emojis to a reply. So I'm hoping that there is some sort of way in which increased interest in this, now that suppressor wait times are lower. I'm wondering if it's possible that Silencer Co. could work with some other companies that have come up since then, like PSA or something like that. Maybe there's a way that we can get that unsuppressed Maxim 9 built. I wanted one so that I could test the integral suppressor versus other suppressors, but it's a fascinating handgun in its own right, and I'm curious about that. People mentioning that this is the Bergman system coming back after 100 years. Yes. So the pistol that I talked about leans very heavily on the Boberg design, which is something that pulls the ammunition out of the magazine rearward. And that is not even original to Boberg. That is what the original Mars pistol did. And I forgot to mention this because that would have been a good thing to point out. Now, I should say that the Mars pistol is not great. Nobody loved it. Nobody wanted to adopt it. It was mechanically complicated. It was functional. And it has some really interesting lessons that you can learn from it. But yeah, it was first. The other thing that people pointed out is that pulling the ammunition out from the rear is something that Winchesters do. Winchester lever action rifles have this tubular magazine, and you pull the ammunition out backwards, and then you lift it up, and then you push it into the barrel. So yeah, this is not a completely revolutionary concept. It has some historical validity to it. But there's also a lot of comments pointing out how finicky this system would be. And I agree 100%. Not only do you need a lot of moving parts to move perfectly together, but you also need the ammunition to work properly. And Boberg is a little bit finicky. The Boberg pistol, now the Bond Arms Bullpup 9, I believe it's called, a little bit finicky on what ammunition it supports. A number of people pointing out some well-known and some esoteric pistols that use gas systems or use rotating barrels or other sort of non-Browning tilt action systems. I also forgot to mention that Glock has made a rotating barrel pistol. It is the 47 or the 46. But this is not the future. This is not what future Glocks are going to have. Glock made it only because they are trying to get a German police contract. And the German police contract specifically wrote, I've seen other agencies do this too. They write a spec for a new service pistol, and it is essentially a Glock. And so they change one aspect of the requirements so that a company other than Glock has a chance of winning the contract. And then Glock just turns around and makes a new gun that fits the requirements so that they are eligible again. Another gas-powered or gas-delayed system that is recent is the M&P 5.7. So Smith & Wesson makes a 5.7 pistol. It looks exactly like an M&P. They're regular M&Ps, but it is gas-operated with a rotating barrel. And I would love to figure out why that is that they went that way. Is it because of the higher pressures of the 5.7 round? Or is it just something that they want to tinker with and they figure that someone who wants to mess around with 5.7 ammo is willing to mess around with a different action, different assembly and reassembly, different cleaning requirements? I'm kind of curious about that. Smith & Wesson did move to Tennessee recently, so maybe when we visit we'll ask about that. A lot of conversation about bullpups, length of pull and balance and things like that. An advantage, a big advantage of bullpups that I didn't mention is that balance is not just a comfort thing and it's not just a speed thing. It also allows you to use the weapon with one hand. And there's some situations where that's a big deal. And there's some situations where it's a smaller deal. But I have talked to medics and they appreciated the capability of having a not full-size battle rifle, but a full-size intermediate rifle that they could use with one hand while their other hand is carrying or dragging in sort of crowd control situations specifically. So yeah, bullpups have a lot going for them despite all of the downsides. I'm not saying it has to be your main infantry rifle, but I do think that bullpups, we will see more of them in the future, even though, as everybody has pointed out, everybody but the Israelis, every army that has tried a bullpup, except for the Israelis, have switched away from the bullpup and don't do bullpups anymore. The Israelis are the only ones who have stuck with it, and not universally. They still have a lot of AR-style platform rifles in their different defense forces. Here's somebody who has a fantastic idea. One of the things that modern polymer-framed double-stack 9mm Wonder pistols generally have are adjustable or replaceable back straps, which is a kind of a cool thing. But for people who have short fingers, it actually would be more ergonomic to have a front strap so that you always have the same shape on the back and you end up padding out the front of the grip, and the trigger finger is able to always get to it. It's kind of an interesting idea. Very, very curious. There's probably a reason that people haven't done that, but there's no mechanical reason that you couldn't do that. The front strap on the front would also let you have finger grooves or not, or different sizes of finger grooves, since people have different diameters of fingers. Any actual firearm manufacturers, give that a little bit of thought. A number of people are talking about different rounds as well. If you have a pistol that has more barrel length and is built around this fighting handgun concept, would you not want to move up to 10mm or something like that? There's a lot of reasons why you would do that, and there's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't do that. There are some really interesting rounds that are necked down and fast for the purpose of armor piercing sometimes, for the purpose of creating hydrostatic shock through velocity other times. I think that is something that is definitely worth tinkering with and playing with. And if your handgun is built for it, if you're confident in your metallurgy and you're confident in your design, there's a lot more PSI that you could have inside of a pistol. Rifles have huge pressures, which is how they're able to get such high muzzle velocities. And you could do that with a handgun. A lot of people mentioning that you should mount the suppressor to the frame and not to the barrel. It definitely would be easier with our T-Rex design because the front slide doesn't reciprocate. But then you still have the issue of all of the gas. If you want to capture all the gas from the barrel, it is really easy just to attach onto the barrel. If you don't quite line up, a lot of stuff escapes to the sides, and that's not the best. It's definitely doable. It's definitely something that a lot of people have worked on and figured out. And you can do stuff with gaskets, rubber gaskets and washers and things like that. They don't last forever, but it's certainly workable. All of this stuff is worth thinking about and tinkering with. And sometimes you invent something amazing, like John Moses Browning did, but that's probably only if you're actually John Moses Browning or Eugene Stoner. Otherwise, you invent stuff kind of by accident. Stuff sort of gets picked up here or there, used for different stuff. A number of people pointing out that there's no ejection port on the PDW version. There actually is, but I didn't show it animating, and I agree that once you put a shroud over the top of the slide, ejections become more of an issue, and clearing malfunctions gets a little bit trickier, but that's okay. Whoever actually builds this gun in real life has to worry about that, not me. The artist's rendition is good enough for this YouTube video. There's also a number of people who recognized and pointed out that The final PDW design that I finished with, looks a lot like the Spectre, made by Sights in Italy, and that is true. I actually mentioned that in the video. It looks a lot like it. And if you are familiar with Forgotten Weapons, you've probably watched Ian talk about that particular gun. And that brings me to the back to the topic of rules. The Sight Spectre was a very cool SMG. But unfortunately, it never got picked up as an SMG for contract. None of the counterterrorism or police groups in Europe actually bought it, which means that all the R&D on that platform by that company was essentially wasted. And they tried to recoup some of their expenses by selling it as a pistol, a semi-auto version, as a pistol that had been nerfed in some other ways so that it was compliant with local regulations. And it just was not a very good pistol because it wasn't designed to be a pistol. It was designed specifically to be a submachine gun. And that didn't help it sell. And so there are significant impacts caused by some of these rules. Ideally, in an ideal world, we would understand that weapons are not intrinsically evil. And so it would be easier to do R&D on them. There are things, trends that sort of come and go specifically because of the rules. So in the early 20th century, a lot of pistols had stocks. And the reason for that was it's much easier to shoot a PDW style weapon that has a stock, 3 points of contact, better eye relief, better sight picture. But unfortunately, thanks to the rules, the NFA that was passed in 1934, you see those things a lot less often. And so there's a whole bunch of development that could happen over here in this space that doesn't really happen very much. It kind of happens. It happens by small speculative companies who are trying to get military contracts very specifically. But when they do that, they build their prototypes around what the military is looking for, the contracts that the military has already put out, the trials that the military has already announced. It's very hard to have the money to do the kind of really outside the box research that is where usually these good ideas come from. Not always. Glock is a great example of a fantastic firearm that came out of a very specific military trial that was announced. But generally speaking, it is the people who are tinkering with the idea, not in a vacuum, but outside of a specific bureaucratic request that come up with the cool ideas and the cool stuff. And in America, you definitely have a much easier time doing this than in Europe, because if you build a firearm that works well, American citizens are, for the most part, free to purchase it and own it and shoot it with some restrictions, which is why stocked pistols kind of went away. Pistol ownership sort of went away in Europe, and stocked pistol ownership was heavily restricted in the United States, so it kind of is gone. It isn't until the ATF allows arm braces to come back that tinkering and experimenting with PDWs continues. Now, obviously, there are some examples, some exceptions rather. They're like the Spectre pistol in Italy, but because that failed as a contract bid, it kind of failed as a product and it kind of failed as a concept. There wasn't a free market where you could actually test this idea. There weren't people who were actually able to get it and use it, and it wasn't manufactured in quantities that made it worth continuing to build it and then build on it. So there has to be a level of freedom for this kind of innovation to actually happen. Another amazing firearm that we own, technically my brother David owns it, that is a perfect example of this, is a Browning high power that was manufactured in Canada specifically to send to China, and it has a beautiful wooden stock, and the Browning is set up with rifle sights. It is a perfect example of something that has practical value that people wanted to buy, but only certain jurisdictions could even have it. And then the reason that David has a copy of that gun is because Mao's Cultural Revolution happened, and a lot of those weapons were never shipped. And technically, the ATF allowed some sort of historical loophole for those weapons to exist inside of America, even though that is clearly a pistol, and it is clearly a stock, and it clearly has rifle sights. All the things that make it a verboten short barrel rifle, the ATF has said is fine. Now, if you were to put different things on that pistol, it would immediately become not fine. But, firearm rules are generally arbitrary and ridiculous in most cases. So I'm not looking for a world where there's absolute and total freedom of absolutely everything. If you've watched previous T-Rex Labs videos and listened to previous podcast episodes, you've probably heard me talk about this idea that people are not neutral. Ideas are not neutral, and actions are not neutral. But I do think that physical items are neutral, and physical items should be freely available for people to tinker with and develop and, own the plans to without being thrown into prison by their governments. When you have that kind of freedom, there is human flourishing of the people who are, not in jail, but you also have firearm companies tinkering with and experimenting with and developing new ideas. They are unencumbered by arbitrary rules that just freeze certain categories or freeze certain mechanisms completely out of any sort of R&D. You actually have the freedom to innovate. And when countries allow their scientists or their entrepreneurs or their engineers to innovate freely, the more likely those guys are going to invent useful tools that country is going to want to have access to in the future. So it's just better. It's just better all the way around. But that is probably enough conversation about gun design. And I feel like we covered the gamut, everything from what firearms are, what firearms aren't, everything from Excel spreadsheets to YouTube comments. So thank you very much for listening to this podcast. And let me know, get a hold of team@trex-arms.com. At the moment, that's the best way to get a hold of me, and let me know what you want to see with this podcast. It is now video, but only on Spotify. So if you're not a Spotify user, that doesn't really do you much good. The video that is in the podcast is only for a small group of people, so I'm not going to lean that heavily into video with it, unless I hear from you guys a really specific kind of direction that you want me to take this thing in. Some of you comment on the podcast on Spotify, because that's a Spotify feature, but again, an only Spotify feature. So let me know what it is you're looking for. If you want more book reviews of good books, or if you want more book reviews of bad books. I understand that the bad book reviews are sometimes more entertaining for you, but they're not necessarily more entertaining for me.